Do you know how a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods will actually affect your daily life? Because if you think it's just about politics, you're missing the financial storm that's about to hit your household budget. Think about this. 60% of the vegetables on your dinner table come from Mexico. Your smartphone, assembled with Chinese parts. Your car, likely built with components crossing North American borders multiple times. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what's coming, but exactly how to protect your finances when these tariffs kick in. The Tariff Earthquake, understanding the 2025 trade policy shift. Did you know the average American household could pay up to $1,200 more per year because of these new tariffs? Let's break down what's actually happening. When most people hear the word tariff, they think it's just a fancy name for a tax on imported goods. But tariffs are so much more than that. They're powerful economic policy tools that can completely reshape trade relationships between countries. Think of them as economic chess pieces that change the entire game when they're moved across the board. The 2025 tariffs we're seeing represent a seismic shift in U.S. trade policy. To put this in perspective, we're looking at the highest effective tariff rate since 1943, a time when the world was in the middle of World War II. That's over 80 years ago. These aren't small adjustments. They're massive economic levers being pulled all at once. Here's where it gets really interesting. The proposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, combined with the 10% tariff on Chinese imports, will affect roughly 43% of everything America brings in from other countries. Just let that sink in. Almost half of all U.S. imports are about to get significantly more expensive overnight. This isn't a small ripple, it's a tsunami of economic change. What makes these 2025 tariffs different from previous trade disputes is their unprecedented scope and the countries they target. Previous tariff battles typically focused on specific sectors or countries with which the U.S. had contentious relationships. But Canada and Mexico? These aren't just any trading partners. They're our next-door neighbors and have been among our closest allies for decades. The North American economy has been deeply integrated since NAFTA in the 1990s and later through the USMCA agreement. Suddenly throwing up these economic barriers is like building a wall between roommates who've been sharing a kitchen for years. The numbers tell a startling story. Currently, the effective U.S. tariff rate hovers around 3%, relatively low by historical standards. But with these new policies, that rate is projected to jump to approximately 10.7%. That's more than triple the current rate. For consumers, this means products ranging from avocados to automobiles are about to get a whole lot more expensive. Of course, the official narrative around these tariffs often centers on protecting American jobs, reducing trade deficits, or forcing other countries to play fair. You've probably heard claims that tariffs are a way to make other countries pay for unfair trade practices. Politicians love to frame it as making China pay or getting a better deal for American workers. And while these talking points make for great sound bites, they often mask the complicated economic reality. But here's the million-dollar question that rarely gets answered honestly. Who really pays these tariffs? Is it foreign manufacturers? Their governments? Or could it be us? This is where the economic rubber meets the road. Despite claims that other countries pay tariffs, the research is overwhelmingly clear on this point. American consumers bear almost 100% of tariff costs through higher prices. A comprehensive study from the Federal Reserve, Princeton, and Columbia University found that the full incidence of the tariff falls on domestic consumers, with no impact on the prices received by foreign exporters. Translation: these tariffs are essentially a tax on American shoppers, not foreign countries. Think about it logically. When a 25% tariff is placed on Mexican avocados, the Mexican farmer doesn't suddenly decide to cut their price by 25% to compensate. Instead, that extra cost travels down the supply chain until it reaches you at the grocery checkout. Multiple studies analyzing the 2018 to 2019 tariffs confirmed this reality. Prices increased almost exactly in line with the tariff amounts, meaning American consumers footed the entire bill. The impact goes beyond just higher prices at the store. Tariffs create ripple effects throughout the economy. They can disrupt supply chains that have been carefully built over decades. They can force businesses to make tough decisions about production locations, staffing levels, and which features to include in products. Some industries might benefit from reduced foreign competition, but many others will struggle with higher input costs and reduced export opportunities when other countries inevitably retaliate. For the average family, these economic policy decisions translate directly into household budget pressures. That $1,200 annual cost increase isn't evenly distributed. It hits hardest on products we use every day, from fresh produce to electronics, clothing to construction materials. And unlike income taxes where higher earners pay more, tariff costs tend to hit lower and middle-income households proportionally harder since they spend more of their income on goods rather than services. The timing of these tariffs also matters. They're coming at a moment when many Americans are already feeling financial pressure from elevated prices following years of inflation. Just as pricing pressures were beginning to ease, these tariffs risk reigniting inflation and potentially forcing the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for longer, adding yet another financial burden through higher borrowing costs for mortgages, car loans, and credit cards. Now that we understand what's happening at the border, let's see how these tariff tremors travel through the supply chain before hitting your wallet. From border to store shelf, how tariffs create price ripples. Those tariff tremors at the border, they don't just travel through your supply chain, they multiply. When your car crosses the US-Mexico border 8 separate times during production, that 25% tariff isn't applied just once. It's layered repeatedly like a tax sandwich that gets fatter with each crossing. This tariff pancaking explains why your $30,000 vehicle might suddenly cost $3,000 more instead of the $750 increase you'd expect from a one-time 2.5% charge. Let's break down what's really happening when products make their international journey to your shopping cart. Modern supply chains aren't simple. They're complex webs where parts and components hop across borders multiple times before becoming the finished product you eventually buy. Think of them as international relay races where each handoff potentially triggers another tariff. This complexity is especially visible in the automotive industry. That American-made car you're eyeing? Its journey probably looked something like this. Raw materials from Canada shipped to Mexico for initial processing, then to the US for specialized components, back to Mexico for assembly, then to Canada for testing, and finally back to the US for final assembly and sale. At each border crossing, different parts of that vehicle face the possibility of getting hit with tariffs. Here's where it gets expensive and a bit mind-boggling. With these new 25% tariffs, a car part worth $100 that crosses the border just once faces a $25 tariff. But what if that same part crosses the border twice during production? Now you're looking at a tariff on a tariff. The component might now cost $156.25. $100 plus $25 first tariff plus $31.25 second tariff on the now $125 value. By the 8th border crossing, the compounding effect has turned a modest tax into a major price hike. So what can businesses do when faced with these multiplying tariffs? They have a few options, and none of them are great news for your wallet. First, they can absorb the costs themselves, cutting into their own profits. But let's be real, most companies aren't exactly eager to slash their margins, especially when shareholders are watching. The second option is what you'll most likely see, passing those costs directly to you, the consumer. And research confirms this is exactly what happens. During the last round of tariff implementations in 2018 to 2019, studies showed that businesses passed between 75% to 100% of tariff costs straight to consumers through higher prices. That's right, almost the entire burden landed squarely on American shoppers, not on foreign producers as was often claimed. But wait, there's more. Even companies not directly hit by tariffs often raise their prices too. It's like when gas prices go up and suddenly everything costs more, even stuff that doesn't need to be transported. Domestic manufacturers see their foreign competition hobbled by these extra taxes and think, perfect time to raise our prices a bit while still staying cheaper than the imports. They're not affected by tariffs directly, but they take full advantage of the pricing umbrella these tariffs create. Let's get specific about what this means for your next shopping trip. That imported washer and dryer set? The manufacturer pays the tariff when bringing it into the country. The distributor then adds their markup percentage on the new, higher base cost. The retailer does the same thing again. By the time you're standing in the store comparing models, that 25% tariff has morphed into a 35 to 40% price increase. And that's for a product that only crossed the border once. The electronics industry faces similar challenges with components crossing borders multiple times. That smartphone in your pocket contains parts from dozens of countries each, potentially subject to tariffs, and each adding to the final price tag through this multiplication effect. A 10% tariff on Chinese electronics could easily translate to a 15 to 20% price increase by the time that fancy new phone reaches your local store. This is what economists call the multiplier effect of tariffs. It's like watching a small snowball roll downhill, picking up more snow until it becomes a boulder. Studies show that due to this supply chain complexity, consumers often experience price increases that are 1.5 to 2 times larger than the actual tariff percentage. A 10% tariff doesn't mean prices go up by exactly 10%. They might jump by 15% or even 20%. And here's the kicker. This multiplier effect hits hardest on products with the most complex international supply chains, which happens to include many of the big-ticket items you buy, like vehicles, electronics, and appliances. The automotive industry is especially vulnerable. Analysts estimate that the proposed tariffs could add approximately $3,000 to the price of some vehicles, far more than a simple 25% increase on the total car value would suggest. Why such a big jump? Because each component faces its own tariff burden as it crosses the border. The engine, transmission, electronics, glass, and hundreds of other parts each accumulate tariff costs that then get bundled into your final sticker price. It's not just a tax on the finished car. It's a tax on virtually every piece that goes into making it. The produce in your grocery cart isn't immune either. Even something as simple as packaged salad might cross borders multiple times. Grown in Mexico, packaged in the US, with dressing manufactured using ingredients from multiple countries. Each step potentially adds more tariff costs that eventually reflect in the price you pay at checkout. What makes this situation particularly challenging is that most consumers never see the complex international journey their products take. We just notice the higher prices without understanding all the border crossings, tariff accumulations, and price markups that happened along the way. That $3 increase on your favorite imported beer isn't just the tariff. It's the result of this whole cascading process of costs multiplying through the supply chain. Your grocery cart, fresh food prices under pressure. That invisible supply chain we just talked about, it's about to become painfully visible in your weekly grocery haul. When 90% of avocados and over half of winter produce must cross the border to reach your plate, a 25% tariff isn't just a distant economic policy. It's the difference between affordable fresh food and luxury items that stretch your budget to the breaking point. Let's talk about your produce section. During winter months, America transforms into a nation heavily dependent on Mexican agriculture. When our fields lie dormant under snow and frost, Mexican farms become our primary source of fresh vegetables and fruits. This seasonal dependency creates a perfect storm when tariffs enter the picture. The numbers tell a compelling story. Mexico currently supplies nearly 2/3 of all vegetable imports entering the United States and approximately half of all U.S. fruit and tree nut imports. That's an astonishing $46 billion worth of agricultural products flowing north across the border each year, including $9 billion in fresh fruits alone. Your guacamole habit? That's particularly vulnerable. A staggering 90% of avocados consumed in the United States come from Mexico, with imports valued at $3.1 billion annually. When these imports suddenly face a 25% tariff at the border, the math becomes concerning for your wallet. But this isn't just about avocados. Your entire produce section faces similar pressures. Those winter tomatoes, bell peppers, strawberries, and raspberries predominantly come from Mexico during colder months. Unlike manufactured goods, where production can potentially shift to different countries over time, agricultural products face natural limitations. Why not just buy American, you might ask? The uncomfortable reality is that during winter months, there often aren't domestic alternatives available at scale. Our agricultural system simply doesn't produce enough winter vegetables and fruits to meet demand. California and Florida growing seasons can only extend so far, and greenhouse production, while increasing, remains insufficient and more expensive than imports. This timing issue creates a unique problem for consumers. When tariffs hit seasonal products with few substitutes, price increases become virtually unavoidable. Unlike a manufactured good where you might choose a different brand, nature's growing calendar severely limits your options during winter months. Previous agricultural tariff implementations have demonstrated this price sensitivity. When certain produce items faced import restrictions or tariffs in the past, consumer prices jumped almost immediately. The economic term for this is price inelasticity. When demand remains relatively stable despite price increases because consumers have few alternatives. Grocery retailers find themselves in a particularly difficult position when facing these tariff-induced price increases. Unlike luxury retailers or technology companies that operate with comfortable profit margins, supermarkets typically function on razor-thin margins of just 1 to 3%. This limited financial buffer means they simply can't absorb significant cost increases without passing them on to shoppers. When a grocer faces a 25% increase in the cost of importing tomatoes or avocados, they have little choice but to adjust shelf prices accordingly. Some larger chains might temporarily absorb a portion of these costs to maintain customer loyalty, but the economics ultimately force price increases. Independent grocers and smaller regional chains feel this pressure even more acutely, as they lack the purchasing power and financial reserves of national corporations. The potential impacts on your grocery budget are substantial. Economic models analyzing the proposed tariff structure suggest fresh produce prices could rise 17 to 29% overall, with winter vegetables seeing the highest increases. For a family of 4, this translates to an additional $300 to $450 in annual grocery expenses, just for fresh produce. Let's make this concrete with some everyday examples. That $1.50 avocado might jump to $1.95 or higher. A pint of strawberries currently priced at $3.99 could reach $5.29. Bell peppers might increase from $1.25 each to over $1.60. These individual increases might seem manageable, but they compound across your entire shopping cart, week after week. The timing couldn't be more challenging for many households. After enduring several years of high food inflation that only recently began cooling, these tariff-induced price increases risk reigniting food price pressures, just as many families were finding budget relief. Lower-income households will feel this dietary squeeze most acutely. When fresh produce prices rise significantly, food budgets stretch thinner, often leading to reduced consumption of these nutrient-dense foods. Public health researchers have documented how price increases on fresh foods can shift consumer purchases toward more shelf-stable, processed alternatives, precisely the opposite direction of most dietary recommendations. Some consumers might resort to frozen alternatives, which could see smaller price increases since they're more likely to be domestically produced. However, even frozen produce relies partially on imported ingredients, so they won't be completely insulated from tariff effects. Restaurants and food service businesses face similar challenges. Commercial kitchens rely heavily on consistent produce pricing for menu planning and profitability. When core ingredients like avocados and tomatoes suddenly cost 25% more, restaurants must either raise prices, reduce portion sizes, or temporarily remove certain dishes from menus, all options that impact your dining experiences. The seasonal nature of these imports creates another wrinkle: price volatility throughout the year. While summer months might see relatively stable prices as domestic production increases, winter price spikes could become dramatically more pronounced under the new tariff structure. Budget-conscious shoppers may need to become even more seasonally aware, adjusting meal planning to align with domestic growing seasons. For home gardeners, the economics of growing your own produce may suddenly become more favorable. Seeds, soil, and gardening supplies generally face less tariff exposure than finished agricultural products. Community gardens and local farming initiatives might see renewed interest as consumers seek alternatives to higher supermarket prices. What might this mean for American agriculture? In theory, higher import prices could stimulate domestic production, but the reality is more complicated. Expanding U.S. greenhouse capacity or extending growing seasons requires substantial investment and time. Agricultural economists project that domestic production would only partially offset import reductions in the auto industry shockwaves, why your next car will cost more. From sticker shock to depleted supply chains, The automotive world is heading for a seismic shift that'll hit your wallet when you least expect it. While we've seen how food prices will climb due to tariffs, your next vehicle purchase might deliver the biggest financial surprise of all. The North American automotive landscape isn't just interconnected. It's practically one giant factory spread across 3 countries. Over decades, automakers have built a production ecosystem where borders barely exist. Components zip back and forth between the US, Canada, and Mexico as vehicles take shape, with each country specializing in different parts of the manufacturing process. This border-hopping manufacturing model was designed to leverage each country's strengths: Mexico's lower labor costs for certain components, Canada's specialized production facilities, and America's engineering expertise. But this efficiency-maximizing strategy is about to collide head-on with a 25% tariff wall. The numbers tell a startling story. Nearly half of all U.S. auto parts come from our northern and southern neighbors. When you pop the hood of your American-made vehicle, you're looking at an international collaboration. Those brakes, possibly from Mexico. The transmission, maybe assembled in Canada. The engine control module could have crossed multiple borders during production. Specific models face particularly steep challenges. The Toyota Tacoma, a favorite among truck enthusiasts, is imported directly from Mexico. The family-friendly Chrysler Pacifica minivan crosses the border from Canada. Even vehicles proudly assembled in U.S. factories depend heavily on parts sourced from these countries, meaning virtually no vehicle escapes the tariff impact. What happens when these complex supply chains hit a tariff roadblock? Jefferies investment bank analysts have crunched the numbers, and they're projecting the average U.S. vehicle price will jump approximately 6%. That's around $2,700 added to your next car purchase. And that's just the average. Some models will see substantially higher increases. Economy cars face a particularly tough situation. These vehicles operate on razor-thin profit margins, leaving manufacturers little room to absorb extra costs. When a $20,000 compact car needs to accommodate a tariff-related cost increase, that percentage jump hits harder than on a $60,000 luxury SUV. Budget-conscious consumers shopping for affordable transportation will feel the sting most acutely, creating a regressive effect where less affluent car buyers shoulder a proportionally larger burden. Automakers have several potential responses to this new reality, but none offer quick or painless solutions. Some might absorb a portion of the costs to maintain market share, but shareholder pressure makes this approach unsustainable long-term. Others will simply pass costs directly to consumers through higher sticker prices. A third option involves redesigning supply chains to reduce cross-border dependencies, but that's a years-long process requiring massive investment. We've seen how the industry responds to tariffs before. During previous implementations, most automakers chose the path of least resistance, passing costs to consumers. This created immediate price jumps at dealerships, leaving car shoppers with sticker shock and tough decisions about downgrading models or postponing purchases. The used car market won't provide much refuge either. Historical data from previous tariff periods shows that as new car prices climb, used vehicle values follow suit. The market functions as an interconnected ecosystem. When acquiring new vehicles becomes more expensive, demand for quality used alternatives surges, pushing those prices upward too. Consumers seeking to avoid tariff-related price hikes by shopping used lots may find less savings than expected. This ripple effect extends beyond just the vehicles themselves. Auto parts, components, and accessories will also see price increases, making repairs and maintenance more expensive. Own a vehicle that requires specific parts imported from Mexico or Canada. Prepare for higher service bills when something needs replacement. The timeline for these changes adds another layer of complexity. Vehicles already in transit or on dealer lots when tariffs take effect might be grandfathered in under previous trade rules, creating a brief window of opportunity for consumers to purchase before price increases take hold. But once that inventory clears, the full impact of tariffs will be unavoidable. Some manufacturers may respond with strategic feature reductions, removing certain options or making previously standard features optional to maintain key price points. A model that previously included advanced safety systems as standard might make them add-on options instead. Interior materials might be downgraded slightly. These subtle changes help manufacturers. Maintain advertised price points while still accommodating increased costs. Geographic impacts will vary too. Communities near auto manufacturing facilities, dependent on cross-border supply chains, may face employment challenges if production volumes decrease in response to reduced demand. Border communities that service the logistics networks moving auto parts between countries could see reduced economic activity. For consumers, this automotive tariff impact creates an urgent decision timeline. If you're considering a vehicle purchase in the near future, accelerating your timeline ahead of tariff implementation could save thousands of dollars. Conversely, if waiting is possible, allowing time for markets and manufacturers to adjust might provide more clarity on which models offer the best value under new pricing structures. What makes this situation particularly challenging is the automotive industry's limited flexibility. Unlike some consumer goods that can quickly shift production locations, vehicles require complex manufacturing infrastructures, specialized tooling, and qualified workforces that take years to develop. When tariffs suddenly change the economics of production, automakers can't simply flip a switch to avoid the impact. For dealerships, these changes will require delicate inventory management and pricing strategies. A vehicle that represented good value one day might become significantly less competitive the next as tariff-influenced pricing takes effect. Dealers will need to adjust marketing approaches and potentially shift their model mix to emphasize vehicles less impacted by cross-border supply chains. The automotive financing landscape will evolve as well. As vehicle prices increase, loan terms may stretch longer to keep monthly payments manageable. While this maintains short-term affordability, it increases the total interest paid and extends the period of negative equity, owing more than the vehicle is worth. Creative financing solutions will likely emerge to help consumers manage higher purchase prices. Digital disruption, electronics and tech prices under tariffs. From your garage to your pocket, tariffs are coming for the tech that powers your daily life. That smartphone you're probably reading this on? It's about to get caught in a pricing pincer movement that combines existing duties with new 10% tariffs, creating a cost surge that even tech giants might not shield you from. The tech sector is uniquely vulnerable to these new tariffs because of its heavy reliance on Chinese manufacturing and components. Despite years of companies trying to diversify their supply chains, China remains the manufacturing epicenter for most consumer electronics. Your smartphone, laptop, gaming console, and even those wireless earbuds you can't live without, they all have deep connections to Chinese production facilities. What makes this tariff situation particularly painful for tech consumers is how targeted it is. Unlike previous trade disputes where consumer electronics largely managed to avoid major tariff hits, this new 10% tariff explicitly focuses on the devices you use most. We're talking about smartphones, laptops, video game consoles, smartwatches, speakers, and even those Bluetooth devices you've scattered throughout your home. The timing couldn't be worse for consumers. This 10% increase doesn't land on a blank slate. It stacks on top of existing duties many electronics already face. For some product categories, this creates a cumulative tax burden that could reach 20 to 25%. Imagine buying a new gaming console that's already expensive, then paying an additional quarter of its price just in tariff-related costs. How will tech companies respond? This is where it gets interesting. Different brands will likely take very different approaches based on their market position and profit margins. A company like Apple, with its premium pricing and loyal customer base, might choose to absorb some of the increased costs to maintain market share. They can potentially spread the pain across their ecosystem of products. Meanwhile, smaller manufacturers operating on razor-thin margins might have no choice but to pass the entire cost increase directly to you, the consumer. Those thin margins are a critical part of the story. Unlike some industries where companies mark up products significantly, many tech companies operate with surprisingly tight hardware profit margins. The competitive nature of consumer electronics means companies often sell devices at minimal markups, planning to make money later through services, apps, or accessories. With such limited wiggle room, there's almost nowhere for these tariff costs to go except straight to your wallet. Some tech executives might be eyeing manufacturing alternatives in countries like Vietnam or India as potential solutions. Several major tech companies have already begun shifting some production to these locations in recent years. But don't expect this to save you from price increases in the short term. These transitions are complex, time-consuming, and expensive. They require building entirely new supply networks, training workforces, and establishing quality control systems that took decades to perfect in China. The feasibility of shifting supply chains to countries like Vietnam or India is complicated, noted one industry analysis. While some companies are exploring these options, the transition cannot happen overnight due to existing contracts and the need for infrastructure development. Let's look at what this means for specific products you might be planning to buy. That new smartphone release you've been waiting for? Industry analysts predict price increases between 8 to 12%, depending on the brand and how much of the tariff burden they choose to absorb. Budget phone makers will likely pass almost the entire cost increase to consumers, while premium brands might shelter customers from some of the impact. Gaming consoles present an even trickier situation. With their already high price points and complex international supply chains, next-generation systems could see price bumps of $50 to $75. For laptops, expect increases of $40 to $120 depending on the model and specifications. Even smaller items like wireless earbuds and smart speakers won't escape. They'll likely see $5 to $15 price increases that might seem small until you start adding up all your tech purchases. The ripple effects extend beyond just the devices themselves. Replacement parts, accessories, and even repair services will likely increase in price as components become more expensive throughout the supply chain. That cracked screen repair that already feels overpriced? It's about to get even pricier as replacement parts face the same tariff increases. For tech enthusiasts who typically upgrade devices frequently, the cumulative impact could add hundreds of dollars to your annual tech spending. A family that purchases a new laptop, couple of smartphones, and a gaming console in a single year might face an additional $200 to $300 in tariff-related costs alone. The electronics retail landscape will shift as well. Stores may start offering longer financing terms to mask the higher prices, similar to what we've seen in the automotive industry. By now, pay-later services will likely become even more prevalent as retailers search for ways to make higher prices more palatable to consumers. What should smart consumers do? If you're planning a major electronics purchase in the next year, you might want to accelerate your timeline. Products already in retail inventory or shipping containers when tariffs take effect might be grandfathered under previous rules, or at least face smaller increases as retailers clear existing stock. For those who can't rush purchases, consider whether slightly older models might meet your needs. Last year's smartphone or laptop typically offers 90% of the functionality at a significantly lower price point, and this gap may widen as tariffs impact newer models more heavily. The long-term outlook for tech prices depends largely on how companies adapt their supply chains and whether these tariffs become permanent fixtures of the trade landscape. If tariffs remain in place for years, expect to see more significant manufacturing shifts to countries not impacted by these duties. However, these transitions take time and still involve costs that will likely be reflected in product pricing. Building material surge, housing costs, and home improvement. While tech companies scramble to adapt their supply chains, another industry is facing a perfect storm of tariff trouble. That renovation you've been saving for? It's about to get significantly more expensive, and your dream home just climbed further out of reach. The 25% tariff on Canadian lumber couldn't come at a worse time for America's already struggling housing market. When you think about building a home, you probably picture wooden frames, drywall, and various fixtures coming together to create your living space. But what you might not realize is just how dependent American construction is on a single foreign source. Over 70% of the softwood lumber that frames American houses comes from our northern neighbor, Canada. This critical supply line is about to get much more expensive. Here's where things get complicated. That 25% tariff isn't landing on a clean slate. It's stacking on top of an existing 14.5% tariff already applied to Canadian lumber. This creates a compounding effect that will dramatically increase costs throughout the construction industry. Imagine paying a premium, then paying another premium on top of that premium. That's exactly what's happening to builders trying to source lumber for new projects. But it's not just the wood in your walls feeling the tariff pressure. The entire construction supply chain is getting hit from multiple angles. The drywall covering those wood frames, Much of that gypsum comes from Mexico, facing the same 25% tariff. Steel beams, aluminum siding, fixtures, and countless other materials essential to construction are all caught in this widening tariff net. This timing couldn't be worse for the American housing market. We're already facing what experts describe as a severe housing shortage. For years, construction hasn't kept pace with population growth, pushing home prices and rents to record levels in many areas. Adding significant material cost increases to this equation only deepens the affordability crisis. Think about what happens when builders suddenly face material cost increases of this magnitude. They have limited options, and none are good for consumers. Some will simply pass these increased costs directly to home buyers, making new homes even less affordable. Others might try to maintain price points by downsizing homes, building smaller houses with less square footage for the same price. Many will cut features and finishes to offset rising material costs, meaning buyers get less house for the same money. For those considering a renovation rather than a new build, the math is equally painful. That $20,000 kitchen remodel you've been planning? It could jump to $24,000 almost overnight when factoring in the tariff impacts on cabinets, countertops, fixtures, and lumber. Bathroom renovations, additions, and even simple repairs all face similar cost increases, forcing homeowners to scale back projects or postpone them entirely. The renovation market is particularly vulnerable because it's often more material intensive than new construction on a per square foot basis. When updating an older home, builders frequently need to replace not just surfaces, but the underlying structures as well, requiring more lumber and materials per project dollar. This ripple effect extends into the rental market too. Landlords facing higher costs for property maintenance and renovations have a simple solution: raise rents. With housing already in short supply, landlords can pass these increased costs to tenants who have few alternatives in tight rental markets. The result: higher housing costs for renters already struggling with affordability. Commercial construction faces similar challenges. Office buildings, retail spaces, and other commercial properties all rely on the same materials facing tariff increases. As construction costs rise, businesses may delay expansion plans or pass increased occupancy costs to customers through higher prices for goods and services. The impact on American jobs is complicated as well. While some argue tariffs protect domestic lumber producers, the construction industry employs far more workers than lumber production. When building costs rise and fewer projects move forward, construction jobs disappear. The math simply doesn't work in favor of net job creation. For individual homeowners, the strategies to mitigate these costs are limited but important. If you're planning a renovation, accelerating your timeline to secure materials before tariff implementation could save thousands. For those who can't move quickly, considering alternative materials or adjusting project scope might preserve affordability. Some builders are even looking at engineered wood products that use less raw lumber as potential alternatives. The regional impacts vary widely too. States with high construction activity and growth, like Texas, Florida, and Arizona, will feel these effects most acutely. The West Coast, with its proximity to Canadian lumber imports, faces particular challenges in finding cost-effective alternatives quickly. So what do all these factors mean for your wallet? According to the National Association of Home Builders, these combined tariffs could add between $8,000 and $12,000 to the cost of building an average new home. For renovation projects, expect cost increases of 15 to 20% across the board. These aren't minor adjustments, they're transformative changes that alter the fundamentals of housing affordability. The long-term outlook depends largely on how long these tariffs remain in place. If they become permanent, expect to see significant shifts in the construction industry. American lumber producers will expand capacity, but they simply can't replace Canadian imports overnight. Alternative building technologies like prefabrication, 3D printing, and advanced materials might accelerate as builders seek cost-effective solutions. However, these transitions take time and investment. For prospective home buyers, this new tariff landscape likely means adjusting expectations. The house you could afford last year might be out of reach next year. For existing homeowners, your property value might increase as replacement costs rise, but so will your property taxes and economic ripple effects, inflation, interest rates, and growth. The rising cost of your dream home might be just the beginning of your financial headaches. While inflation seemed to be cooling down over the past year, economists now project these sweeping tariffs could push it back above 3%, just when we thought we'd tamed the inflation beast for good. And that's just the start of our economic concerns. When tariffs hit, they don't just affect the specific products being taxed at the border. They function as a kind of stealth inflation, raising prices across multiple sectors simultaneously. Think of it like dominoes falling. When the cost of raw materials increases, manufacturers pay more for inputs, retailers face higher wholesale prices, and eventually, those price increases work their way through the entire economy. What makes tariffs particularly problematic from an inflation perspective is their immediate and widespread impact. Unlike other forms of inflation that might develop gradually over time, tariff-induced price increases happen almost overnight across countless product categories. From the avocados in your grocery cart to the lumber in your home renovation project, prices jump in unison, creating an inflation surge that's hard to ignore. According to the latest economic forecasts, the combined impact of these tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China could boost overall inflation by somewhere between 0.4 and 1.0 percentage points. This might not sound like much until you realize how hard the Federal Reserve has been working to get inflation down to their 2% target. Adding a full percentage point could push inflation back above 3%, essentially erasing a year's worth of progress in the battle against rising prices. This brings us to what economists call the Fed's impossible choice. The Federal Reserve typically responds to inflation by raising interest rates, which cools down economic activity by making borrowing more expensive. But these tariffs are coming at a particularly tricky time. The Fed had been planning to cut interest rates to support economic growth as inflation seemed under control. Now, they may have to halt those plans or even consider raising rates if inflation accelerates. The Federal Reserve may face a dilemma due to the inflationary pressures from tariffs, which could prevent them from cutting interest rates as previously anticipated, explains one economic analysis. Higher inflation could lead the Fed to maintain or even raise interest rates to combat rising prices. Think about what that means for your daily life. If interest rates stay higher for longer, you'll continue paying more for mortgages, car loans, and credit card balances. A mortgage rate that stays at 6% instead of dropping to 5% means thousands of extra dollars in interest over the life of your loan. Auto loans might remain above 7% instead of falling closer to historical norms. And the average credit card interest rate, already near record highs around 20%, could climb even higher. For young adults hoping to buy their first home or upgrade to a larger space for a growing family, this interest rate situation creates a double whammy. Not only are home prices rising due to material costs, as we discussed earlier, but the higher mortgage rates mean your monthly payment for the same house could be hundreds of dollars more than you anticipated. Beyond inflation and interest rates, there's the more fundamental question of economic growth. Several economic forecasts suggest these tariffs could shave between 0.3 and 0.7 percentage points off U.S. GDP growth in 2025. When you consider that the economy typically grows around 2 to 3% in a healthy year, losing half a percentage point represents a significant slowdown. This growth reduction happens through multiple channels. First, higher prices reduce consumer purchasing power, meaning people buy fewer goods and services overall. Second, businesses facing higher input costs may delay expansion plans or cut back on hiring. Third, the uncertainty created by trade tensions makes companies hesitant to invest in new projects or equipment. But what about jobs? Don't tariffs create American jobs by protecting domestic industries? It's complicated. The tariffs are indeed expected to create job gains in protected industries like steel, aluminum, and some manufacturing sectors. A steel mill that can now charge higher prices without foreign competition might expand production and hire more workers. However, these job gains in protected industries are typically offset by job losses elsewhere. When manufacturers face higher costs for materials, they often reduce their workforce to compensate. Retailers selling more expensive imported goods may see reduced sales and need fewer employees. Agricultural producers who lose export markets due to retaliatory tariffs might scale back operations. As one economic analysis states, the tariffs are expected to create job gains in protected industries, but these gains may be offset by job losses in sectors facing higher input costs, particularly in manufacturing and agriculture. the million-dollar question on everyone's mind. Could these tariffs actually trigger a recession? Most economists stop short of making that prediction based on tariffs alone. The U.S. economy is resilient, and many sectors would continue functioning normally despite trade tensions. However, the risk factors multiply if these tariffs remain in place for an extended period and if other countries retaliate with their own tariffs on American exports. The combination of continued high interest rates, reduced consumer spending power, business uncertainty, and disrupted trade patterns could potentially push a slowing economy into negative territory. There's also the psychological factor to consider. Consumer confidence plays a huge role in economic health, and trade wars tend to make headlines that worry average Americans. As one analysis points out, the uncertainty surrounding tariffs has already begun to impact consumer confidence and spending, with a notable decline in consumer sentiment reported, which could further exacerbate economic challenges. When consumers get nervous about the economy, they often delay major purchases and increase savings as a precaution. This rational individual behavior can collectively lead to reduced economic activity, further slowing growth. So what's the bottom line for the economy? While a single round of tariffs probably won't cause immediate economic disaster, the combined effect with retaliatory measures could significantly dampen growth. Most projections suggest that with full implementation of the proposed tariffs and likely retaliation, 2025 economic growth could drop to near zero levels. Not quite a recession, but uncomfortably close to that line. This creates a precarious situation where any additional economic shock, whether from energy markets, natural disasters, or financial system stress, could be enough to tip the economy into negative territory. It's like driving a car at 5 miles per hour. You're less likely to cause an accident than at 60 miles per hour, but you're also less able to power through obstacles in your path. For young professionals and families trying to build wealth and financial security, this economic environment requires careful navigation. The traditional advice to buy low, sell high becomes much more complicated when both inflation and economic slowdown are concerns simultaneously. Stagflation, the combination of high inflation and low growth, is a particularly challenging economic environment that many of today's investors have never experienced firsthand. Retaliation nation, how other countries fight back. Think stagflation sounds bad? Wait until you see what happens when Canada targets your weekend beer run with 25% tariffs. When countries fight back against trade restrictions, they don't just pick random products. They strategically aim for maximum political damage by hitting products from key voting regions. Ever wonder why bourbon and orange juice are in the crosshairs? When a country imposes tariffs, the economic story doesn't end there. It's just getting started. Trade partners don't simply accept new tariffs without a response. Instead, they craft retaliatory measures designed to create maximum political pressure. This isn't just economic policy. It's economic chess where every move triggers a counter-move. Canada's just announced plan to slap 25% retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of American goods isn't a random selection of products. Their target list reads like a politically calculated hit job: beer, wine, bourbon, home appliances, and Florida orange juice. But that's just the opening salvo. If U.S. tariffs remain in place, Canada plans to double down with an additional $86.2 billion in tariffs within just 21 days. And Canada isn't alone in this economic counterattack. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has made it clear they won't sit back quietly either. While they haven't revealed their specific targets yet, Mexico is busy preparing its own retaliatory package that will likely hit American exports hard. Meanwhile, China has already pulled the trigger, imposing 15% tariffs on chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton, plus 10% tariffs on crude oil, agricultural machinery, and large vehicles including pickup trucks. What makes these retaliatory tariffs so clever and painful is their laser-focused precision. Foreign governments don't randomly select products. They deliberately target goods from politically influential states and regions. Kentucky bourbon isn't on Canada's list by accident. It's because Kentucky holds significant political influence. Florida orange juice faces tariffs because Florida is a crucial swing state. This strategic targeting creates domestic political pressure from affected industries, essentially turning American businesses into lobbyists against their own government's tariff policies. Farmers know this painful dynamic all too well. During the 2018 to 2019 trade war, U.S. agricultural exports took a devastating hit when China implemented retaliatory measures. According to USDA figures, American farmers lost approximately $27 billion in export sales during that period. Soybeans and pork producers were especially hurt as their products sat unsold, while Chinese buyers found alternative suppliers in countries like Brazil and Russia. These agricultural impacts aren't just statistics, they represent real financial hardship for American farming communities. When a soybean farmer can't sell their harvest because of retaliatory tariffs, the effects ripple through rural economies. Farm equipment purchases get delayed, local businesses suffer from reduced spending, and family farms face genuine financial crises. In some cases, these export markets never fully recover, as buyers find permanent alternative suppliers. What makes the current situation potentially worse is the multi-front nature of these retaliations. Unlike 2018 to 2019, when China was the primary retaliatory actor, we're now facing coordinated responses from three of America's largest trading partners simultaneously. This creates fewer safe harbors for U.S. exporters looking to redirect their products. But tariffs aren't the only tool in the retaliation toolkit. Countries increasingly deploy non-tariff barriers that can be equally damaging but harder to challenge under international trade rules. These include regulatory barriers that suddenly find problems with American products, delayed inspections where perishable goods sit at borders until they spoil, and licensing restrictions that make paperwork mysteriously more complex for U.S. companies. These non-tariff barriers can sometimes be more damaging than the tariffs themselves. When a shipment of American beef faces enhanced inspection procedures that delay it for weeks at a Canadian port, or when Mexican authorities suddenly require new certification paperwork for U.S. electronic components, these measures effectively block trade without technically violating trade agreements. The uncertainty created by this environment becomes its own economic drag. Companies delay investments, redirect supply chains, or simply pass higher costs to consumers. Planning becomes nearly impossible when businesses don't know which products might face new barriers next month. When you combine America's initial tariffs with the full range of retaliatory measures now taking shape, the economic impact multiplies dramatically. While the direct effect of U.S. tariffs alone might reduce GDP growth by 0.3 to 0.7 percentage points, economic models suggest that full retaliation could double this negative impact to 0.6 to 1.2 percentage points. That's enough to potentially eliminate 200,000 to 400,000 U.S. jobs across multiple sectors. These job losses wouldn't just hit the obvious export-oriented industries. When an American whiskey distillery cuts production because their Canadian sales plummet, they need fewer barrels from cooperages, less grain from farmers, fewer bottles from glass manufacturers, and fewer services from marketing firms and transporters. The employment impact cascades throughout supply chains and local economies. This explains why economists consistently find that trade wars produce no winners, only varying degrees of losing. When countries exchange retaliatory measures, both sides experience economic damage, with consumers and workers ultimately bearing the costs. For everyday Americans, this creates a double financial squeeze. You'll pay more for imported goods due to U.S. tariffs, while simultaneously facing potential job insecurity if your industry gets caught in the retaliatory crossfire. Industries that rely heavily on exports, including agriculture, manufacturing, energy, and increasingly services, face the most significant risks. Some defenders of tariff policies argue that short-term pain leads to long-term gain by pressuring trade partners into new agreements. However, historical evidence suggests retaliatory cycles often persist longer than expected. The 2018 to 2019 trade tensions with China were expected to resolve quickly, but instead dragged on for years with many tariffs still in place today. What's particularly concerning about the current situation is how quickly Canada announced its detailed retaliation plan, clearly indicating they had been preparing their response well in advance. This suggests trade partners anticipated these tariffs and aren't likely to back down easily, potentially leading to a prolonged period of economic friction. For specific industries, the impact varies dramatically. American bourbon and whiskey exports to Canada could drop by 30 to 40% if previous tariff episodes are any indication. U.S. cheese makers, already dealing with domestic cost pressures, now face the prospect of losing significant Canadian market share. Technology companies selling hardware to Mexican businesses may find themselves priced out by competitors from tariff-free countries. Perhaps most troubling is how these retaliatory measures could interact with the already fragile manufacturing sector. When Canadian tariffs make American-made appliances less competitive in their market, and Mexican tariffs reduce demand for U.S. auto parts, factories already walking a financial tightrope may find themselves making painful decisions
Your financial
about
defense
production
strategy
levels and staffing. Practical steps to protect your wallet. As manufacturing jobs hang in the balance, your household budget faces its own tightrope walk. Did you know the average family could slash their tariff exposure by 30 to 50% with the right strategy? The difference between financial stress and stability might come down to decisions you make before these policies fully kick in. The financial storm heading our way won't hit everyone equally. While we've explored how tariffs will impact various sectors, let's get personal about your money. The truth is you can't dodge every financial bullet from these tariffs, but with smart planning, you can significantly reduce their impact on your household budget. First, understand that your vulnerability depends largely on your spending patterns. If you're a tech enthusiast constantly upgrading gadgets or planning a major home renovation, you're more exposed than someone with simpler spending habits. And if you're working with a tighter budget, these price increases will hit proportionally harder since necessities consume a larger slice of your income. Let's talk immediate action steps. Timing is everything when it comes to major purchases. If you've been on the fence about buying that new refrigerator, laptop, or car, accelerating your timeline before tariffs take effect could save hundreds or even thousands. This isn't about panic buying, but making calculated decisions about inevitable purchases. For everyday items, a strategic stockpiling approach makes sense. Consider buying an extra month's supply of non-perishable imports you regularly use, canned goods, coffee, chocolate, or personal care products from affected countries. Just don't go overboard or put yourself in debt doing it. A small buffer can help you ride out initial price increases without lifestyle changes. Budget adjustments are your next line of defense. Now's the perfect time to review your spending and create what I call a tariff buffer. Essentially reallocating 3 to 5% of your budget to accommodate rising prices. This might mean trimming subscription services, entertainment expenses, or dining out slightly to maintain your financial balance. Looking beyond the initial shock, medium-term strategies become crucial. Start exploring alternative products that might not be subject to the same tariff pressures. For instance, if Mexican avocados become prohibitively expensive, perhaps it's time to discover domestic alternatives or different foods that provide similar nutritional benefits without the tariff markup. This is also your opportunity to become a more informed consumer. Look at country of origin labels when shopping. Items produced domestically or imported from countries not targeted by tariffs might suddenly become the better deal. What seemed like the expensive option last year might now be the budget-friendly choice. Strategic substitution is another powerful approach. Maybe your favorite French cheese becomes too expensive, but an American artisanal variety suddenly becomes competitive. Or perhaps that Chinese-made electronic gadget could be replaced by one manufactured in Taiwan or South Korea. These small pivots can add up to significant savings when applied across your entire shopping list. Your investment strategy also deserves attention during this tariff transition. Certain sectors stand to benefit from these trade barriers, while others will struggle. Domestic manufacturing, particularly in protected industries like steel, aluminum, and furniture, might see growth as imports become less competitive. Alternative supplier countries not facing tariffs could also experience manufacturing booms. On the flip side, sectors heavily dependent on imports, consumer electronics, automotive, and retail, might face profit squeezes. If you're an investor, this might be the time to review your portfolio allocation and consider whether you're overexposed to sectors likely to suffer tariff pressures. For homeowners, the renovation equation has changed dramatically. With building materials facing significant tariff-induced price increases, the timing of your projects takes on new importance. If you're planning essential repairs or renovations in the near future, accelerating your timeline and purchasing materials before tariffs take full effect could yield substantial savings. When renovation can't be advanced, explore creative sourcing strategies. Local suppliers might offer materials not subject to tariffs, or you could consider alternative materials altogether. Recycled or reclaimed building materials not only avoid tariff markups, but often provide environmental benefits too. And don't overlook the possibility of duty drawback programs if you're using imported components for exported products. These can provide significant rebates. Debt management takes on new urgency in a tariff environment. With inflation potentially pushing interest rates higher, variable rate debt becomes particularly risky. Consider locking in fixed rates now before any inflationary pressure from tariffs pushes borrowing costs higher. If you have home renovation plans requiring financing, securing that funding before potential rate increases could save thousands over the life of the loan. Credit card debt deserves special attention too. With average rates already hovering around 20%, any further increases driven by inflation could make revolving balances even more toxic to your financial health. Prioritizing debt reduction now creates flexibility to handle unexpected price increases later. Perhaps the most powerful approach combines all these strategies into a comprehensive financial defense system. By timing major purchases strategically, stockpiling selectively, adjusting budgets proactively, exploring alternatives thoughtfully, and managing debt aggressively, you create multiple layers of protection against tariff impacts. The effectiveness of these strategies varies by household, but financial planners estimate most families can offset 30 to 50% of tariff-related price increases through careful planning. That could translate to hundreds of dollars saved annually despite the challenging economic environment. For a median household facing potential additional costs of $1,200 to $2,000 yearly, cutting that impact in half makes a meaningful difference to financial stability. Don't underestimate the psychological benefits of having a plan either. While many Americans feel helpless against macroeconomic forces like tariffs, taking concrete actions to protect your finances provides a sense of control during uncertain times. This proactive approach not only shields your wallet, but reduces financial anxiety too. Remember that tariffs, like most economic policies, create both winners and losers. By understanding the shifting economic landscape and positioning yourself strategically, you can minimize your losses and potentially even find opportunities amid the disruption. Financial resilience comes not from avoiding every economic storm, but from having the right protective gear when they hit. The new global trade map, long-term shifts and supply chain rewiring. Beyond individual financial strategies, there's a massive economic migration happening that will transform everything you buy. Remember how the 2018 tariffs were supposed to be temporary? Those short-term policies have already triggered the biggest supply chain upheaval in decades, with thousands of factories packing up and moving to entirely new countries. And the 2025 tariffs will accelerate this global manufacturing exodus tenfold. When tariffs hit, they don't just raise prices, they fundamentally alter where things get made. The 2018 to 2019 tariffs already set this in motion, pushing companies to reconsider their heavy reliance on Chinese manufacturing. Many businesses decided the 25% tariff premium wasn't worth it and began looking for alternatives. This wasn't just minor tinkering with supply chains. We're talking about massive factory relocations and the creation of entirely new manufacturing hubs. Vietnam has been one of the biggest winners in this shifting landscape. When companies started feeling the heat from those initial tariffs, many looked to Vietnam as an alternative manufacturing base. The country's share of global manufacturing has jumped significantly as companies like Nike, Samsung, and Apple moved production there to sidestep those Chinese tariff costs. Mexican manufacturing also grew during this period as companies sought to bring production closer to the U.S. market. What's fascinating is how these supply chain shifts create new winners and losers on the global stage. When a major electronics company pulls out of China and sets up shop in Vietnam, they bring thousands of jobs, infrastructure investments, and economic growth with them. Meanwhile, the regions they leave behind face factory closures and economic contraction. One country's tariff policy can literally reshape the economic destiny of other nations halfway around the world. The 2025 tariffs are poised to supercharge this trend, but with a twist. Since they target Mexico as well as China, companies are now scrambling to figure out their next move. Should they stick with Mexico despite the new tariffs? Shift to other countries in Central America? Return some production to the U.S.? These decisions aren't made lightly. They involve billions in investment and years of planning. The concept of nearshoring has gained serious momentum in recent years. It's the idea that companies should bring production closer to where their customers are, reducing shipping times, cutting transportation costs, and minimizing supply chain disruptions. Before the new tariffs on Mexico were announced, many U.S. companies were actively pursuing nearshoring strategies, moving production from Asia to North America. Now they're caught in a difficult position: continue with nearshoring to Mexico despite the tariffs, or look for other solutions. Similarly, friendshoring has emerged as a strategic approach where companies concentrate their supply chains among politically aligned countries. Rather than simply chasing the lowest production costs, more businesses are considering the geopolitical risks of where they manufacture. Does a country have a stable relationship with the U.S.? Is it likely to face trade restrictions in the future? These questions are now just as important as labor costs or tax rates when companies make location decisions. The reality is that shifting manufacturing locations is incredibly complex and time-consuming. When a company decides to move production from China to Vietnam, they can't just flip a switch. They need to find suitable facilities, establish new supplier relationships, navigate unfamiliar regulatory environments, hire and train workers, and ensure quality standards are maintained. This process typically takes many months to years, especially for complex products like electronics or vehicles. This transition period creates a fascinating economic limbo where companies are caught between tariff regimes. Some might rush to ship as much inventory as possible before tariffs take effect. Others might temporarily absorb the tariff costs while working on their relocation strategy. And some might decide that paying the tariffs is still cheaper than the massive investment required to move operations. Looking ahead, we're likely to see new trade agreements and economic blocs forming in response to these tariff policies. As the U.S. raises barriers with traditional trading partners, those countries might strengthen their economic ties with each other or with different regions entirely. Mexico and Canada might deepen their trade relationships with Europe or Asia. China could accelerate its efforts to build economic partnerships throughout Africa and Southeast Asia. The countries poised to benefit most from this reshuffling include Vietnam, which has already positioned itself as a manufacturing alternative to China. India offers another attractive option with its massive workforce and growing industrial capacity. Thailand has a well-established manufacturing base that could absorb production from both China and Mexico. And despite the new tariffs, certain Central American nations might still attract companies looking for relatively close production to the U.S. market. For businesses, this uncertainty about tariff policies creates a planning nightmare. Should they invest millions in relocating production, only to have tariff policies change after the next election? Or should they pay the tariffs now and wait to see if the political winds shift? Most are adopting a hybrid approach, moving some production to avoid tariffs while maintaining flexibility to adapt to future changes. This massive supply chain restructuring will eventually create new shipping routes and logistics hubs. Ports that primarily handled Chinese goods might see less traffic, while facilities in Vietnam or India could expand rapidly. Shipping companies will adjust their routes to service these emerging manufacturing centers. Even railroads and trucking networks within the U.S. might need to adapt as entry points for imported goods shift from West Coast ports to Gulf of Mexico or East Coast locations. For everyday consumers, these changes will happen largely behind the scenes. You won't necessarily know that the shirt you're buying was made in Vietnam instead of China, or that the parts in your car came from Thailand rather than Mexico. But these shifts will influence everything from product availability to pricing to delivery times. The environmental impact of these supply chain changes is worth considering too. In some cases, longer shipping routes mean higher carbon emissions. Newer manufacturing facilities might use more modern, energy-efficient technologies, but the construction of these facilities also carries an environmental cost. Companies making these transitions are increasingly factoring sustainability into their decisions, both for environmental and cost reasons. What's particularly striking about this manufacturing migration is how it reverses decades of globalization trends. Since the 1990s, supply chains have become increasingly integrated and complex, with components and products flowing freely across borders. The current wave of tariffs is forcing a fragmenting of these global networks into regional clusters, a fundamental restructuring of how goods get made and moved around the world. For investors, these shifts create both risks and opportunities. Companies heavily invested in Chinese manufacturing might struggle with the transition costs, while those with more flexible, diversified supply chains could gain a competitive advantage. Logistics companies serving emerging manufacturing hubs might see significant growth, as might industrial real estate in countries gaining manufacturing share. So here's the reality check. The 2025 tariffs are about to hit your wallet in a major way. We're talking about the federal government collecting an astonishing $1.2 trillion in additional revenue over the next decade. And guess who's footing that bill? You are. The impact on your household could range from $1,200 to $2,700 extra per year. That's not just a small inconvenience. It's money that won't be going toward your retirement, your kid's college fund, or that vacation you've been planning. But here's the good news. You're not helpless in this situation. By understanding how these tariffs work and where they'll hit hardest, you can make smarter financial decisions. Whether it's timing your big purchases, choosing alternative products, or adjusting your investment strategy, you have options. This new economic landscape isn't going away anytime soon. The winners will be those who adapt quickly and make informed choices. The financial future is still yours to shape,